Yes, hello to you all once more. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. And as you can see, we are out and about on our travels once again. And today we've crossed the border once more from Scotland back into England to Bassenthwaite to cover round 5 of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2023 Championship. Now this track here at Bassenthwaite is normally used for modern motocross racing, but the track owner Ian Ridley and his band of merry men have been working tirelessly for the last 2 or 3 weeks to tone down some of the more difficult parts of the track to enable it to be used as a classic and vintage racetrack venue. Now, as it stands, we have yet to be issued with a programme of the race format for today, but I expect it will still be the old pre-65 bikes right up to those relatively modern bikes of the 1980s, or of course the twin shock class as they used to be called. But of course, before we see any bikes on the track, we'll do our usual Paddock walkabout. So let's head back there right now and take a look at some of those very nice machines that are soon to take part in this round 5 event here at Bassenthwaite. Okay, so let's get our Paddock walkabout started by taking a look at Gary and Nigel Sowerby's 490 Maicos, a couple of very good examples of these fantastic open class twin shock German rocket ships. So first up, this is Gary's 490, which originally wasn't really a twin shocker at all, but the later Alpha 1 monoshock version, and as is the norm in these modern times, Nigel's converted his bike into a twin shocker by re-engineering the bike's rear swing arm. And as you can see, Gary's bike has the piston port 490 two-stroke motor, which even for the 1980s was still highly competitive in the big open class formula, and it was more than capable of keeping the rider up there at the sharp end of the pack. Now, as I said, Gary's converted his bike to a twin shocker by re-engineering this steel box section swing arm, which usually meant cutting it and then putting a bit of a dog leg bend on the back and then adding mounting brackets for the brand new twin shock suspension units that would fit onto either side. But naturally, it would also involve making adjustments to the bike's chassis so that you had top mounting brackets as well to take those twin shock suspension units. Although this is still a very quick bike, as you'll soon discover if you check out all of the racing highlights from this Bassenthwaite Round 5 event, which will be posted quite soon. But these handguards that Gary's fitted onto his bike will certainly come in very handy, because this is quite a stony racetrack here at Bassenthwaite, so they should protect his hands from most of the flying debris from the track. But it's still a fine looking piece of machinery, this Alpha 1 twin shock bike of Gary's, and as I said, quick as well, as you'll soon find out. So next up, it's another one of the Sowerby family's 490 racers, and this time it's Nigel's 1981 490 Mega 2, although Nigel's bike here is again not a fully stock original bike either, because it's fitted with this replacement Wolfsport alloy rear swing arm, which again is a quite rare item, as very few of these Wolfsport alloy swing arms were actually made, and you can see that they're beautifully constructed, although as to why they're not being made these days, I don't actually know. And again, Nigel's motor is a 490 engine, but a reed valve version this time, and not the piston port motor that we saw on Nigel's bike earlier. But they say that these reed valve engines are a much nicer power plant to ride because it doesn't tend to bog down if you drop the revs going into tight corners, which is of course different on the piston port motors, where you have to keep the power on to prevent that same scenario happening. But either way, both this reed valve and the piston porters are still fantastic engines that usually have more than enough grunt for your average club rider to handle. But these big 490s are still held in high esteem by the dirt bike riding press around the world, who continually list these 1981 490s as the king of all of the twin shock motocross bikes of that legendary 1980s era. So certainly a fine pair of 490 classics there from Gary and Nigel Sowerby. Now next up, it's a very brief look at John Porch's 500 horsepower factory twin shock Honda, and I do remember John telling me on the day that this was one of the early examples of one of these awesome HPFs from the early 1980s, and basically, as I recall, these bikes were made from American C&J chassis, using of course the big Honda XR500 motors as its power source. And then it was usually a case of HPF then taking the stock 500 4-stroke engine and then retuning it and boring it out and adding high performance cams, etc., and basically just giving it a huge overdose of steroids to beef it up, and at the end of the process you ended up with a big powerful brute of an engine that could certainly take on anything on the track. Now, I'm sure you're already aware that the motor's cylinder head was a twin port exhaust type of layout that had these twin exhaust header pipes that then connected into a single tailpipe here at the rear, and there was quite a blast from this big megaphone pipe when that big Honda engine got fired into life. And as we move on to the front end of our HPF Honda, it was a pair of Suzuki front forks that were used, and also the Suzuki's twin leading shoe front brake and hub was also utilised as the bike's front stopper. At the back end of our HPF, it was a pair of top quality Works Performance piggyback shocks, and as you can see, rear wheel clearance certainly wasn't an issue on this bike, but the swing arm was an aluminium part, but again, from which particular bike I'm not too sure, but this certainly could be a Thor constructed item, but then again, I'm only guessing here because I don't actually know for sure. But if you've ever been lucky enough to see one of these big HPFs in action on the track, then you'll already know just how fast and competitive these bikes are, because if you get the right rider in the driving seat of one of these big horsepower Hondas, then there's not really much that'll overtake you on the track. But again, maybe sometime in the future we'll take a much closer look at this John Porch's HPF here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel. Okay, so next up you have a nice couple of classics, and first up, this is Ian Ward's 1966 250 Villiers, which Ian tells me is not an original bike from any particular year, because this is a combination of different parts from different makes and models of machines, and usually if Ian sees a part that he thinks it might make his bike run or handle better, then he tries to find a way to make it fit. But it's still a nice old school practical kind of race bike that's maybe not the fastest machine on the planet, but according to Ian, it's a lot of fun and generally reliable. But as I remember, Ian's motor is from 1966, but it's not a fully original motor because, again, it uses parts from other Villiers engines, and it also uses a Japanese Mikuni carburetor as well to feed it with its fuel. Now, Ian has two race bikes in his possession, and these front forks have actually been taken off his BSA bike, and Ian's then fitted the forks from his Villiers onto the BSA because he said that both bikes seem to work much better with each other's suspension fitted onto them. Because this Villiers of Ian's is very much a Bitsa kind of bike that has lots of different parts from other motorcycles bolted onto it, and as I remember, the fuel tank was from an RM Suzuki, and of course that seat again is more than likely from another weird and wonderful machine. So that's Ian's first race bike, his nice 250 Villiers, which brings us quite nicely to Ian's other chosen race weapon, and this is his lovely BSA, a proper old school kind of bike with lots of that nice alloy steel and a bit of chrome there as well, much like many of the great British bikes from the 1960s when tracks across the UK would be filled with these kind of BSAs and Triumphs and the like, which of course were all prior to the Japanese motorcycle invasion of the 1970s. Now, you may remember that I mentioned that Ian swapped the forks from his Villiers bike onto this BSA, and he of course then put the BSA suspension on to the Villiers because he thought that both of these bikes really handled better with the other forks fitted to their chassis. But I did ask Ian what make and model of rear hub was fitted on this BSA, and he said that he wasn't sure because this hub came with the bike when Ian first bought it. But normally Ian alternates between his BSA and his Villiers, and usually he uses the BSA in the age-related classes as the second part of the day's race programme, but mainly it's his old faithful Villiers that he relies on to get his results, because he's been riding this bike for quite a few years now, and up to date so far it's been very reliable. But nevertheless, two fine looking machines. That's Ian Ward's lovely 250 Villiers and his 4-stroke BSA. Okay, so next up on our paddock walkabout, it's Graham Smith's RM400 Suzuki, and once again another old workhorse there, and just one of two bikes that Graham brought along to this round 5 meeting with his other steed, his beloved IT250 Yamaha, tucked up safely in the back of his van. And once again, these old RM400s are another one of the bikes that you don't see too often racing these days, because as far as I'm aware, they were pretty fast bikes back in their day, which I can imagine would have been the late 1970s or maybe even 1980 for this particular model, which had this 5-speed 2-stroke piston port motor, which I'm sure was the very last of the air-cooled Suzuki motocross motors, because Suzuki of course went on to liquid cooling on their RMs in 1981, and they also switched from the old twin shock rear suspensions to the single monoshock at the rear. But you can certainly see that Graham's bike's certainly no garage queen, because this bike and also Graham's IT Yamaha both get plenty of track time, so it's usually just the basic maintenance issues that are given priority to get the bike ready for a race event. So no time for any spit and polish on this bike to make it look good on the day. But don't let the bike's looks fool you, because she may not be that great to look at, but she's certainly a great performer on the track, as you'll soon see when I do eventually get around to posting all of the racing footage from this round 5 event. And again, Graham's made up a pair of hand guards from a couple of bits of old plastic, probably because he's just too tight to buy the real thing, but nevertheless these are certainly going to come in very handy when he takes to this stony Bassenthwaite racetrack. Although it's certainly still another quite good example of one of these twin shock RM400 Suzukis. It's not a concourse winning machine, but certainly look out for Graham at the sharp end of the racing pack when he races this bike in the big pre-1984 class, which incidentally did supply some fantastic racing on the day. Now, while we're on the subject of rare bikes, here's another one that you don't see every day, and this machine here is Mike Walker's 1974 250 twin shock KTM. Now, I do remember being told on the day that the tank and the rear shocks on this bike weren't original parts, but then again, what do you expect on a motocross bike that's now heading for almost 50 years old? And was actually amazed at all that Mike was going to ride it on the track, because most of these old KTMs are now usually tucked away in private motorcycle collections or other motorcycle museums. So it's certainly hats off to Mike for keeping it out there on the track. But certainly our 1974 KTM 250 was powered by this piston port 250 two-stroke engine, which had this kind of silver paint on the casings, because as I remember earlier in 1974, KTM painted these casings black before then changing them to silver in the latter half of 1974. But again, correct me if I'm wrong here, I'm pretty sure that this was a 6-speed gearbox that was inside these 250s, and you can see that Mike's KTM is certainly showing its age after almost 50 years of track time, but it's no disgrace to an old bike that's lived its life being battered around all manner of off-road racetracks. But as I just mentioned, this is a different fuel tank on this bike, as I think it should have been a red alloy tank that was on our KTM, whereas this part here is a plastic replacement, so there's certainly no need to leave any comments to the contrary, because there are still one or two other non-stock parts on our rare KTM, including these replacement rear shocks, which again is no surprise considering the age of the bike. But these shocks will be every bit, if not better, than the 1974 originals that were fitted in that year. Although I still think that this bike would make a great restoration project, because most of all of the important parts of the bike are basically all intact, and you can still source brand new old stock parts for these old KTMs direct from Austria. And because these older KTMs are getting a bit harder and harder to find, it makes sense to me just to try and preserve what stocks that we have, but who knows, maybe as the years roll on, Mike will eventually treat his rare 250 to a full restoration. Now, one of the most impressive transporters that I came across on my travels around the Bassenthwaite Paddock was Andy Barnes's well decked out bike trailer, all liveried up with the mighty Maico 490 logo, and all nicely done in the Maico colour scheme as well. So obviously Andy is a bit of a fanatic when it comes to German race bikes, and he also had a nice couple of 490 Mega 2s parked there next to it. Now, I didn't find out as to who it was that actually did the graphics or the paint job on Andy's trailer, but imagine if you had your van or trailer all nicely liveried out in a similar style. But I was well impressed, to say the least, because it was without doubt a quite unique piece of kit, not to mention, of course, the two 490s that were parked next to it. So one of the first bikes that I came across on the day that were advertised for sale was this quite tidy BSA Victor Scrambler belonging to Brian Aird, and again another good quality old school type of scrambler that's served Brian quite well down the years, and he told me that this bike has all of the correct parts bolted onto it and is a perfect machine for somebody looking to get themselves into classic racing. Now, Brian told me on the day that he was selling the bike because he also has another BSA, which you can just see there in the left hand side of your picture, and he's also got a couple of other bikes as well, so he was looking just to thin out his herd, so to speak. But this B44 motor certainly has all of the correct internals and parts fitted to it, and I've actually filmed this bike many times through the years, and I've always found it to be very reliable and quick when it was out there on the track. So there's plenty video evidence available of this bike's performance if you just take a look at some of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's scrambles on my YouTube channel. But it's certainly a good, honest little bike that's both quick and reliable, so if you think you might be in the market for a good, solid British classic, then just give Brian a quick call on the number that I just recently posted. So this is one of the reasons that Brian's selling his BSA, because this is his current race bike, another cracking looking BSA thumper, all decked out in this quite nice blue livery, which as I remember was all done by Brian himself, but I never actually got a list of the parts that were used to build this particular bike, but if it's built as good as his previous machine, then it'll be a quality bike, that's for sure. And as we move on to the bike's power plant, which is another big B44 BSA engine, but this time the motor's been bored out to a 500 cc unit. But you certainly can't beat these old BSA engines for grunt and power, and that's another reason that makes them so popular for use as a pre-65 or even a pre-68 scrambles machine. But again, another quality bike from Brian Aird. Now, the next bike on our paddock walkabout is a quick look at Matt Slinger's 1977 YZ400 Yamaha. Again, another quite rare Yamaha specimen from the late 1970s, but nevertheless a nice looking bike that appears to have most of the correct parts bolted onto it from that year, although I think that alloy tailpipe is possibly a replacement. Now the 1977 YZ400 had this two-stroke reed valve motor with that big Mikuni carburetor supplying the fuel, and from what I can remember, I think this was quite a decent motor of its day, as of course many of the old YZ engines were from that late 1970s and early 80s period. But this bike here of Matt's is in fantastic condition for a machine that's 46 years old now, and I think the only part that's not stock on Matt's Yamaha is this alloy tailpipe here at the rear. But again, you certainly don't see many of these 1970s YZs on the racetracks nowadays, although it's normally the 1980s Yamahas that are the more popular. But without doubt, another good selection of diverse dirt bikes that were on display at this round 5 event at Bassenthwaite, and this 1977 YZ400 of Matt's was certainly one of the more outstanding classics. Now it appears these days that you just can't wander around the paddock at a classic or twin shock race meeting without bumping in to at least half a dozen of these Honda red rockets, and this example here is John Sinnett's current race bike, but again not a fully stock example of one of these legendary racers, because very few of these red devils still have all of their original parts still fitted onto them because of their age. But when they were launched here in the UK in the late 1970s, to put it lightly, the motocross world had never seen anything like them before, and it was also around this time the Japanese motorcycle invasion began, and it wasn't too long before we were then saying goodbye to our European Bultacos, Maicos and Montesas, and embracing the Hondas and Kawasaki's and Suzuki's that were coming from Japan. But certainly straight out of their packing crates, these red rockets were highly competitive with their light tubular steel chassis and of course that potent 250 two-stroke motor. And even although John's bike here has a replacement swing arm and those Fox air shocks on the back, this is still a good example of one of these mega Honda red rockets. But not only does John have the Honda bike, he's also got some nice memorabilia tucked away in his transporter as well.
When did you sign that then?
Last year in Scotland, yeah.
Up at Drumlandwick?
Yeah,
right.
He came over, yeah. But that, Chris, that's an original shirt from Farley Castle.
Right.
That's
From
back 77 Grand Prix, yeah.
77, so is that your shirt then?
No, I don't know who wore that in those days, but I got that from Farley, yeah. A
Right.
little bit washed out now, but...
So is that all your mementos in the back there?
yeah, something like that, yeah.
We're doing a quick interview here.
1968 on a 350 BSA, was it?
Well, I did have a 350 BSA, yeah, and a 250 Dot.
And I had a Tiger Cub.
And I last rode here on a 250 twin port CZ in 1970.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Steve Shaw.
Stephen Shaw.
Steve Shaw,
Stephen
right.
Shaw,
Right.
yeah. And I first rode here in, 71?
Right.
Yeah.
On an AJS, yeah. so
Welcome back.
we're back.
I recognise the car park, but I don't recognise
A nice little impromptu interview there with the legendary John Sinnett and Stevie Shaw. But this next bike here is Craig Holmes's very tidy BSA. Now this was a bike that was actually raced and built by legendary CCM rider and fellow Scotsman Jimmy Aird, and Craig has only recently just bought this bike from Jimmy at the start of 20 23. So I expect that he's still getting used to the bike as the current racing season progresses. But once again, I don't have any information with regards some of the parts that went into building this bike, but I expect that if Jimmy Aird built it, then it wouldn't have been put together using just run-of-the-mill BSA parts. Although it's certainly a quality machine, as you can see, with what looks like a big BSA B44 motor, which I expect will have been tuned to the max. Now, at the front end of Craig's bike, it looks to me like it's a pair of Maxton forks that have been bolted onto the front end of this bike, and at the rear it's certainly a pair of British-made RockShox, just to try and help keep the back of that bike in its place. And again, a nice piece of artwork there on the alloy BSA tank with that British flag front and centre. But hopefully sometime in the future we'll maybe be able to have a quick word with Craig, and then he can fill us in about all of the parts that are used on this bike and how they perform on the track. And you should be able to catch a glimpse of Craig's BSA in the up and coming racing highlights that are soon to follow. So next up, it's Trevor and Malcolm Petrie's John Hand Racing JBR Rotax 500 twin shockers, and this number 30 bike here is Malcolm's race machine. Now, these superb JHR bikes, or the chassis at least, are all made by John Hand Racing, and John builds his own version of these JBR twin shock chassis, which are fantastic quality, and the two brothers of both Malcolm and Trevor each have a version of these big Rotax thumpers. Now, both of these bikes are of course powered by this big 500cc Rotax 4-stroke motor, which as far as a 4-banger motocross engine is concerned is an excellent choice as a power plant, because these big Austrian-made Rotaxes are mega powerful and virtually unbreakable, and they can certainly take all manner of punishment, even from the toughest of riders. And you can see here on Trevor's bike that he has an identical motor to his brother Malcolm's machine. And at the back end of these John Hand bikes, it's a Grimeka rear hub with, of course, the John Hand Racing swing arm there as well. But up at the front end, it's a pair of Italian Marzocchi forks that are used as the bike's front suspension system. But when both Malcolm and Trevor take part in these kind of classic scrambles, you can see that they both enjoy their JHR Rotax races, and they certainly attract a lot of attention when they're put out there on display around the paddock, and you can certainly see why with that combination of the superb John Hand frame and the big Rotax motor, and of course that alloy replica CCM fuel tank as well. But again, two lovely JHR racers from Trevor and Malcolm Petrie. Right, so next up it's Philip Witham's 360 Spanish Bultaco. Yet again another fine example of one of these legendary 1970s race bikes that were very prominent on the European racetracks in the early to mid 1970s. That was of course as I mentioned earlier, before the Japanese bike invasion of the 1970s, when the likes of these old Bultacos were then being traded in so that riders could purchase the very latest motocrossers that were coming in from Japan. But certainly these Bultaco two-strokers were very good engines, just a simple two-stroke piston port motor that was very well made and certainly not short in the horsepower department, but at the back end of Philip's bike he's opted to fit a pair of British rock shocks instead of the old beater units that probably would have been fitted to these bikes way back in the day. But it's a fiberglass fuel tank as well, with its Bultaco badge now missing after Philip's recent spill on the bike at the Helsington Scramble just recently. But these rock shocks do make the bike a bit taller at the back end than it would have been originally, but that's all probably down to how Philip likes the bike set up for racing. And up at the front end of our little Bultaco, it still has its original beater forks from the 1970s, which, as I remember, were quite good for their time. But many a world-class rider cut their motocross teeth on these Spanish Bultacos before then moving on to the latest motocross race machines from Japan. But having said that, these were still very quick and agile motocross race bikes that were equally competitive against the Kawasaki's and the Hondas of their time. And this bike here of Philip's is a superb example of one of these European off-road classics. Okay, so we're going to wrap up our walk around this round 5 Bassenthwaite Paddock by taking a look at Chris Rogerson's twin shock Maico 320. Now I know exactly what you're thinking. Maico never made a 320, and obviously this is some kind of hybrid special that we're looking at, but the bike certainly looks like it could be made up from a later frame, maybe an Alpha 1 chassis that's being converted to a twin shock layout. And this 1982 or maybe even 1983 250 motor has been re-engineered to make it into a 320cc power plant. Although without doubt these 250 reed valve Maico motors were still good enough even in their stock standard trim, so I expect that Chris has added a few more horses to this motor after boring it out to 320cc. But once again, a replacement alloy rear swing arm that's been doctored to take a pair of YSS twin shock suspension units on the back, but it's quite common to see these kind of swaps on these later Maicos to change the steel box section swing arm for one of these lighter alloy parts, which although were lighter than the factory steel part, they never seemed to be as strong as the Maico originals. And once again, this is another bike to look out for when I post the racing highlights from this round 5 at Bassenthwaite, which will of course be my next video here on my channel. And you can see Chris doing battle on his twin shock Maico in the pre-1984 class. But this is certainly the very first time that I've seen a 250 Maico bored out to 320cc, which surely has to take that barrel to the limits of its engineering tolerances, but nonetheless it's still a cracking looking bike, and quite quick to boot if you check out the racing highlights that are very soon to follow. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a quick look at some of those quite nice looking bikes that are soon to take part in this Scottish Classic Round 5 event here at Bassenthwaite. But of course, as usual, don't forget you can see all of those bikes and many more like them when they take to the track. So if you haven't already subscribed to CDB TV, then I do hope you'll consider doing that very small thing, because that way you won't miss out on any future videos that I post on my channel. But from all of us here at Bassenthwaite, for the time being, it's goodbye for now.